And now I have become death, the destroyer of worlds.
It feels like 2023 turned out to be a very different year for movies than the industry was expecting, with audiences seeming to care less about the safe bets and gravitating more to less conventional and original works, both from established masters as well as from emerging directors, which left me quite hopeful about the current state of cinema, despite the fact that some of the best movies barely got to shine in the theater before being swallowed up by the streaming services. As for my personal favorite movies of the year, I'm always on the lookout for thematic richness and emotional depth, for stories that move me, challenge me, that get me thinking. Keep in mind that I haven't been able to see every 2023 movie yet. There are some promising looking titles that unfortunately don't release here until next year. But of the movies I did see, I put together a list of 10 of my favorites, which I'll be presenting in no particular order. But first, some honorable mentions. Beau is Afraid, directed by Ari Aster. A fascinatingly strange rollercoaster with some of the funniest and absurd sequences I've seen in a long time. Not all the chapters of this episodic journey, however, felt equally compelling, but I can imagine revisiting this one in the future and having the whole thing click into place more than it did on my first viewing. Godzilla -1, directed by Takashi Yamazaki, combines the gripping intensity of Dunkirk with a genuinely heartfelt human drama to deliver one of the greatest monster movies I've ever seen. Not only is this iteration of Godzilla an absolute force of destruction, but the way its devastation overwhelms an already broken nation also adds a lot of thematic weight about the trauma of war and the resilience of the human spirit. 20 Days in Mariupol, directed by Stislav Chernov. A harrowing documentary about the beginning of the Russian invasion in Ukraine, told from the intimate perspective of a team of journalists trapped in the besieged city of Mariupol. You've no doubt been hearing a lot of news about the invasion, which generally comes to us in reports about troop movements and number of casualties. But by really zooming in on a comparatively small place and moment in time, on the actual human beings losing their homes and their loved ones, this movie serves as an important reminder of what is truly at stake during conflicts like these. Barbie, directed by Greta Gerwig. I didn't expect Barbie to be as funny as it was, but I had a blast watching the strange absurdity of its story and the amazing comedic performances. Thematically, it felt like it covered a lot of ground, ranging from general existential fears to more specific social-political commentaries, which I found to be thought-provoking and meaningful, though it did feel a little bit like it sacrificed some depth by trying to address so much at once. Before we get into my favorite movies of the year, I briefly want to say thanks to my patrons and to everyone who has been supporting my work these past few years. This video has no sponsor, it's just for all of you. You are still the most consistent factor in what's been allowing me to do this for all these years, and for that I can't thank you enough. I'm also very excited to update you on some stuff that's been happening behind the scenes. Mainly, I'm going to be away for a few weeks as I will soon be going on my honeymoon, which will be a once-in-a-lifetime journey to... And also, I have an announcement for a major project that I'm going to be working on next year, but I'll talk more about all of that at the end. First, let's discuss my favorite movies of 2023.
I just want you to know one thing. I'm not a monster.
Anatomy of a Fall, directed by Justine Triet, begins with a tragedy. A man falls to his death from the window of his isolated mountain house. The only others who were present were his wife Sandra and their blind son Daniel. A detailed investigation takes place, and the death is concluded to be a suspicious one, with Sandra being the prime suspect. What follows is a long and exhausting trial that not only breaks down the fateful event in immaculate detail, but also completely tears apart Sandra's life, her relationship with her husband, and that with her son. And that's really what this movie is about. It's not so much about reaching those exciting twists and turns that you might find in more typical murder mysteries, but about that process of stripping down someone's entire existence, and about what that reveals about the nature of our lives and our identities. There's something quietly terrifying about the idea of being put on the stand and having to justify your entire life. Having to expose your intimate self to a cold and hostile dissection that turns every aspect of your everyday being into something suspicious that suddenly no longer feels as solid and familiar as it once did. From all the mundane little inconsistencies to the deepest flaws in your character. There is a fractured and often contradictory nature to our existence, which in itself is already an unsettling thought. But to be confronted with it in this manner takes it even further, as it also confronts us with just how fragile our connection to life really is. How limited our individual subjective perspectives that can twist and distort, that mix factual observations with self-constructed meanings. And how easily everything we thought we understood about us and about those closest to us can be reframed and misconstrued by other forces around us to the point where our entire sense of reality starts crumbling down. In Anatomy of a Fall, this is the nightmare that Sandra goes through. And by the end of it, perhaps more than anything, it left me hoping it would never be mine. Moving on to the other grand trial that turns into an existential nightmare, Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer. So I recently got this in the mail. Already got the Steelbook Ultra HD Blu-ray a while back, so yeah, you can say my obsession with this movie is growing. There's just something about it that really clicked the third time I saw it. And I want to do more research before I write my definitive breakdown, which will probably be sometime next year. I already gave you my initial thoughts on its thematic content in an earlier video, but I think the real key to understanding Oppenheimer, not just as a story but really as a cinematic experience, is that it's almost like an opera or a symphony. You know, it's about attuning yourself to the flow of it and letting its current carry you along. When Tenet came out, people often referred to that quote, "Don't try to understand it, feel it," as a sort of secret message to the audience about how to best experience the movie. And if I had to pick a line from Oppenheimer that has a similar function, it would be Niels Bohr saying,
"The important thing isn't can you read music, it's can you hear it. Can you hear the music, Robert?"
Indeed, when I first saw Oppenheimer, I really liked it. I did. But I also felt a bit overwhelmed. There was just so much information to take in, so many complicated histories clashing together, so many characters to keep track of. I worried that when the dust settled, I would come to the conclusion that Oppenheimer would end up in the lower tier of Nolan's filmography. But as I was watching the movie for the third time, something changed, and I think what happened is that I was no longer trying to read the movie, which is not quite the same as not trying to understand it. If anything, I think I had come to understand it quite well, at least in terms of understanding the basic sequence of events that the movie covers. Instead, I noticed I was just listening. I was hearing the music, both literally as I was enjoying the beautiful score, but also in the sense that I was engaging the movie almost purely emotionally, like as a musical experience that just swept me up and brought me along varying tonalities and crescendos until eventually reaching that ultimate finale. That, to me, is what makes Oppenheimer such a monumental achievement. The way it took this deeply complicated character, this deeply complicated part of modern history, captured the raw emotion at the heart of it all, and turned it into music. Directed by Felix van Groeningen and Charlotte van der Meers, The Eight Mountains is a decade-spanning epic about a friendship between two very different men who nevertheless share a deep connection. In many ways, it felt like this movie was made specifically for me. For one, it's set in the beautiful Alps, which might just be my favorite place on Earth. These mountains imprinted themselves on me a long time ago, forming the backdrop to camping trips, hikes, and other adventures that I now look back on as some of my fondest childhood memories. And every time I return there, I feel like I can tap right back into all that joy and beauty, like it's preserved in the rocks. and in the trees, and in the fresh mountain air. It's strange really how one place can become what feels like a physical extension of your own inner landscape. Or perhaps it's the other way around. Maybe it's the places that impact us when we are young that carve out the shape of our soul. Either way, the question then, which the Eight Mountains beautifully explores, is how do we relate ourselves to those places that have become so inextricably connected to our innermost being? Of the two friends, there's one who stays and one who leaves, but every few years they reconnect, each sharing their struggles and victories, and each of them coming to understand what their respective life decisions have gained them and what it has cost them. At one point, the young man who became the wanderer, and who will later write the very story that was shown in the movie, wonders who learns the most. The one who has seen every corner of the world, or the one who made it to the top of the great mountain at its center. It taps into those conflicting desires of wanting to experience what's out there, wanting to enrich yourself with all that it is that the world has to offer, and of wanting to plant your roots, to become intimately connected to a place to the point where it feels like that outer landscape directly reflects the inner one. But in its thoughtful ruminations on these questions, the Eight Mountains also goes one step further by questioning to what extent these matters are really ours to control. Questioning how deeply we can embed ourselves in our center before we become so rigid that it renders us immobile. And how far and how long we can travel away from it before we grow so disconnected that it becomes impossible to return. The landscapes of Gotland are of a very different breed than those in the Eight Mountains. Directed by Line Palmesen, Gotland is about a young Danish priest sent into the remote wilderness of Iceland to establish a new church. His ambitions, however, are quickly thwarted by the hostility of the native population and of the land itself, which, although breathtakingly beautiful, also seems to reject the coming of this messenger of God. In this sense, Gotland feels akin to movies like Martin Scorsese's Silence or Werner Herzog's Aguirre, The Wrath of God. Stories about the clash between man's hubris, his will to impose his own vision of how the world is or should be, and the stark, uncaring reality he inevitably runs into, and that he is eventually overpowered by. But far from being derivative, Gotland has its own distinct sensibilities that set it apart within the genre. For one, the movie is beautifully shot, and it has a slow but deliberate pacing that, like The Priest, draws you into a world of promise only for it to slowly transform into a darker, almost otherworldly realm. One that is bleak and hostile, yes, but also one that invokes its own form of reverence, and that might even extend its hand and offer some form of harmony, if only we would be able to recognize it. But besides bringing religion, the priest also carries a heavy rudimentary camera through which he seeks to capture the land. But in doing so, he only further demonstrates his disconnect from it. For through the camera, which feels like it stands as a token of our technological age, he perceives the world only indirectly, sees only what he wants to see, and only widens the rift between himself and the world he could have been a part of. Many of these elements can also be read through the lens of colonialism. Iceland has historically been under the control of Denmark before becoming an independent nation. But admittedly, I don't know much else about this part of history and therefore can't really speak to the more specific details that the movie explores. For me, I resonated mostly with the more general theme of entering into a strange, mysterious world, falsely believing you can transform or even capture its essence, and paying the price for it, of which Gotland presents a beautiful account. Of all the movies I saw last year, David Fincher's The Killer is probably the one I have the most trouble wrapping my head around. And in that sense, it is the one that I found most fascinating. A lot of interpretations have already been offered on what this false narrator hitman story is really about. The Killer is actually a stand-in for Fincher himself, a perfectionist who has to make his way back up to the top after a failure. Whether that failure was Alien 3 or the more recent Mank, I'm not sure. Or perhaps it's Fincher coming to terms with the many misinterpretations of his movie Fight Club by creating a satire of all the men who are living in their own little fantasy world where they are much cooler than they really are, who pretend they're living out some grand self-important adventure while at the same time being coddled by the comforts of modern society. More generally, there does seem to be some consensus that the killer is about a man who thinks he's living by some strict code of conduct, while in reality he's not as great as he thinks he is. He's continuously breaking his own rules and basically spends the entire movie cleaning up after his own mistake. But then again, he does seem to understand very well, as he keeps repeating to himself, what path leads to the best possible outcome for him. And in the end, he does seem to come out on top. He does achieve his own best interest. Maybe it was a different tale then after all. One of corporate responsibility or lack thereof. A high-value corporate suit messes up big time, but delegates the consequences to those on the lowest end on the social ladder, and only starts showing real mercy when he reaches those with money, power, and influence. After which he gets off scot-free while pretending he is not one of them. He is actually one of the many, just like you. But who knows, maybe Fincher was just deliberately messing with the audience. Maybe the whole point is that beneath all these layers of self-deception, there is no singular truth, and we are all just grasping for straws. Either way, The Killer is a immaculately crafted and highly entertaining movie that blends the narratives that define our lives and identities from the inside, the impenetrable forces that shape them from the outside, and all the strange consequences and contradictions that arise from their collision, to create one fascinating portrait of the human experience.
Joe, where's the step stool?
One sec.
Directed by Todd Haynes, May December opens with an actress visiting a couple to do research for her upcoming movie about their past, which, as we quickly find out, is one defined by an illegal romance, a pregnancy, and a prison sentence. And despite the couple seeming happy now, the excursion into their history does uncover a range of repressed feelings and unresolved conflicts that have been hiding beneath the surface. May December is the kind of psychoanalytical exploration that we don't often see anymore. It reminded me a lot of some of Ingmar Bergman's classics, with Persona being the most obvious parallel as the actress, played by Natalie Portman, starts emulating Julianne Moore's character in an attempt to find the truth at the heart of her being, while struggling with the limitations of her access to the private interiority of this person, and with the interference of her own judgments and desires. What results is a deeply fascinating exploration about the interplay between internal and interpersonal conflicts, and about the nature of repression and pretense. During one pivotal scene, the actress talks about how acting out a sex scene in a movie can sometimes blur the line between pretending and doing it for real, resulting in her no longer knowing whether she is pretending to experience pleasure or if she is pretending not to. Caught in the middle of all this is Joe, played by Charles Melton, a young man whose life is most affected by this examination of his past and by what this sets in motion within him. Through him, we also get a better understanding of how all this plays out over time, how our childhood experiences can lock us in place or propel us forward faster than we should have, both of which have defining impacts on who we become as adults. Combined with some amazing performances and Todd Haynes' fantastic sense of atmosphere, May December presents a compelling character study that carefully threads the line between taboo and actual transgression, showing compassion where it can, restraint where it needs to, and that more than anything seeks to understand, to unravel the often complex and at times troubling relationships between human beings. Killers of the Flower Moon is the long-awaited epic from master filmmaker Martin Scorsese about the murders of the wealthy Osage people in the 1920s. It's clear that Scorsese has always had a fascination with human evil, temptation and sin. But as he's reaching the end of his incredible life and career, it feels like he's really achieved some true insight, some true wisdom into these matters that I believe he thoughtfully and intelligently captured in his account of this true story. For although Scorsese has often followed the perspective of the sinner in his movies and tried to depict evil as somewhat relatable, as something that we are all potentially capable of or could be enticed by under the right circumstances, Killers of the Flower Moon feels different. Whereas movies like Goodfellas or The Wolf of Wall Street might depict the act of selling your soul as a bit too enticing, in Killers of the Flower Moon there's little to no celebration of the spoils, only the direct confrontation with the suffering that's being inflicted. And that our main character Ernest, played by Leonardo DiCaprio, is so intimately connected with, and yet seems to feel so very little about. It creates a fascinating contradiction, as the kind of evil that he represents, the kind of evil that permeates the oil-rich country of the Osage people, is as unmistakably clear as it is incomprehensible, as outrageous as it is completely banal. For what we see in Ernest is someone who does seem to care for the people around him, but who at the same time has no apparent issue inflicting great harm on them. Is it because he is simply an idiot, someone who lacks the intelligence to really comprehend his own actions? Well, he's definitely not the smartest character, but the real nature of his evil, as this movie makes abundantly clear, especially in the final reckoning between Ernest and his wife Molly, lies more in his sheer incapability to look inwards and to see himself for what he really is. And although I don't think it is Scorsese's intention to suggest that we are all like this, he does hold up a mirror asking us, as confrontational as it can be, to do the very thing that Ernest couldn't. If you have seen my video on Celine Song's debut feature movie Past Lives, you already know how I feel about it. I thought this was a wonderful and quietly subversive love story that plays around with our expectations to eventually surprise us with some deeper existential reflections that really caught me off guard, and that I haven't stopped thinking about ever since. Though presenting itself as a love story challenged by time, distance and the interference of other people, what Past Lives really is, at least to me, is an exploration of the complexities of human connections, of coming to terms with the unfolding of our lives, both the aspects of it that we choose for ourselves and those that were chosen for us, and of the limitations of language that seem to prevent us from properly articulating all of these profound emotions. Instead of falling into the bitter melancholy of a worldview defined by random chance and inherent meaninglessness, or assuming an overly naive perspective of destiny in which everything was meant to be after all, Past Lives beautifully walks that narrow line between realism and romanticism, and demonstrates how the two inevitably come to coexist within us as we grow older in a frustratingly contradictory yet weirdly harmonious melting of youthful nostalgia and adult understanding. It's about acknowledging how our past, once wide open and full of potential, is now firmly and unchangeably written in time. And yet, our connection to it remains alive and fluid, allowing us to form bridges, to revisit part of ourselves that were thought to be lost, and make our peace with them. In the end though, Past Lives emphasizes the relational aspect of all of this. How neither our present realities or our past histories are suspended in a vacuum, but instead exist on the intersections of the lives of others. Some we touch only briefly, others we develop intimate connections with. And if we do, we have to contend with the fact that no connection is ever fully complete, that there are parts of ourselves and of them that aren't mutually accessible. But if we make an effort, as this movie so poignantly shows us, we can open ourselves up to precisely those parts of our partners that feel the most distant, allow them in, and grow closer in the process.
Good night, my sweet. Okay.
So glad that's over with, God.
There is a subtle, often underappreciated challenge to making a movie about the experience of childhood. For when you truly tell a story from a child's perspective, whose perception of the world is, by our adult standards, still small, uncomplex, undeveloped, you run the risk that your movie will feel the same way. That's why childhood movies are so often told from an older perspective to add some extra layers of nostalgia and other more adult emotions. Or simply feature a more grown-up story with grown-up conflicts that just so happen to have kids in them. And though this isn't necessarily a bad thing, it's also kind of a shame. Because if you do fully commit to a children's perspective, fully commit to telling a story that's not just about their perspective, but really told from their perspective, that's when you can get something truly special. That's when you get Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret, directed by Kelly Freeman Craig. Told from the perspective of a young girl named Margaret, who just moved into a new neighborhood where she faces all the ups and downs of being the new kid. Finding new friends, struggling to fit in, developing crushes, and so on. The most remarkable thing about this movie to me was the way it captures these, what in hindsight feel like the silly struggles of childhood, but which at the time were experienced as deeply important life or death matters, with empathy and without judgment. Even when Margaret starts asking her first rudimentary questions about existence and God and the meaning of life, which on the face of it do really seem quite simplistic. A less determined director probably couldn't have resisted sprinkling in some more adult reflections here to avoid appearing shallow. But not this one. Kelly Freeman Craig never lets Margaret, and by extension the movie in its entirety, break character in this sense. And in doing so, I think she captured something beautifully honest, truthful, and relatable about the experience we all went through. Set in a high-class boarding school in the 70s, The Holdovers, directed by Alexander Payne, is about a rather cynical and unlikable history teacher who is forced to babysit a handful of students who are unable to go home during the Christmas break. After a few days, only one remains, a kid who has lots of potential yet who is also a major pain in the ass. The two characters obviously clash, but eventually a bond forms between them. Everything about The Holdovers, from the look and sound of it to the story it tells, feels like it's coming straight from a bygone era. And though it is certainly nostalgic for a time that feels quaint by our modern standards, it doesn't romanticize it. If anything, the return to the 70s is a sobering experience, one that strips away the easy projections we so often cast backwards to reveal a past that was marked by its own specific hardships. And more importantly, one that, on a fundamental level, is defined by the exact same struggles, fears and desires as ours. There's nothing new in human experience, the teacher remarks at one point.
Each generation thinks it invented debauchery or suffering or rebellion, but man's every impulse and appetite, from the disgusting to the sublime, is on display right here.
As such, The Holdovers is less about what used to be and more about where we are today. To finish the teacher's argument.
You see, history is not simply the study of the past, it is an explanation of the present.
And what Alexander Payne seems to have found in his study of the past is a picture of humanity that is shaped by class, politics, by grief and by suffering, but also one that is nevertheless profoundly humanistic. In their own way, each of the titular holdovers display a deep longing to connect, to belong, to love and to be loved. It is perhaps not the most groundbreaking message, but it is a timeless one, and one that's perfect for the holiday traditions during which we remind ourselves of precisely that. Of that which matters not only in our present moment, but always. Well, that was it for my favorite movies of the year. So far at least, because as I mentioned at the beginning, there are some promising looking titles that still have to come out here. But those will have to wait, because I'm going to be away for a few weeks. As a lot of you already know, I recently got married. Thank you for all the wonderful messages, by the way. I wasn't able to respond to all of them, but know that I did read them and they meant a lot. Thank you. And for our honeymoon, we're going to New Zealand, which will be a once-in-a-lifetime journey that we've both been looking forward to for many, many years. We'll be there for 5 weeks until the first week of February, which for the channel means that there won't be another video until later that month. But when I get back, aside from my regular videos, for which I already have way too many ideas, there's also something else I'm going to be working on, something I've been meaning to make for a long time. And that's a sort of like Stories of Old canon, my personal list of the 50 greatest movies ever made, with a small essay covering each one. As you can imagine, this will be one giant video that will probably take me all year to finish, but I'd love to take you along the process in some way. I'm not sure yet what form this will take, but I'll definitely be posting updates and exploring suggestions in the Like Stories of Old Discord server, which you can find on my Patreon page. Thanks again for all of your support, happy holidays, and I look forward to seeing you all again in 2024.